Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery. I am Edward Blackthorne, and here we begin this chilling case. The housemaid who rang the bell after death. On a quiet afternoon in street, Aldwin's. The servants swear they heard the maid ring the brass tea bell 10 minutes after she was found dead. If the dead do not serve tea, then who or what was moving through the house? An impossible crime. A whisper of fear in the corridors, and a village full of secrets only Miss Marple can unravel. Before we begin, where are you listening from? On that mild late summer afternoon, when the lawns at Greythorn House lay like green velvet and the sky wore a temper of gentle blue, Mrs. Isabel Renton was very conscious of appearances. The bunting had been looped with more taste than money. The tables dressed with crocheted cloths, and a large glass bowl of dahlias were the kind that hover charmingly between homely and aspirational. And the attendance, half the village and almost all of its opinions, was as good as one could hope for when one has recently inherited a large, slightly shabby house and an even larger, entirely unshabby mortgage. Miss Marple, who has never looked as if she expects anything more than the exact amount of sugar she requests, sat primly at the edge of a wrought iron chair and took in everything that needed to be taken in. Her knitting lay obediently in her bag. That small, white, manageable task was not required here. It was the larger, darker kind of thread that would soon prove difficult to keep from tangling. There were, for those who looked closely, small signs of trouble brewing beneath the pleasant surface. The little housemaid, Rose Hitchens, had passed among the tables with a plate of lemon cake. Her eyes reddened, though not the violent red of fresh weeping, but something more subdued and troubling. A pin had been jabbed through the corner of her apron to make it sit straight, which suggested the economy of someone with little time to spare for proper preparation. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Lydia Pottle, who wore good intentions like a bright scarf, whatever the weather, had twice attempted to engage the young man from the village, Ned Coombs, in discussions of better prospects, a euphemism that everyone, including Ned, chose to misunderstand. Colonel Denham, square and neat as a bookend, watched Mrs. Renton with a certain proprietary air and the faintest clench of the jaw whenever Mr. Felix Ardingly, newly established in Tie Lane as a dealer in fine clocks and finer gossip, laughed too easily at something she said. "All very nice," remarked Mrs. Tully in a caring whisper to the dressmaker. "But I did hear she let the blue bedroom last spring for 6 guineas a week. 6! To a gentleman one never saw except after dark. You can't expect the dark to come in for nothing," the dressmaker returned, quick as a needle, and both women were gratified by their own native wit. At precisely 4 o'clock, there came that bright, obliging chime, the little silver bell that lived in a saucer beside the sponge cake, a neat ring that seemed to carry the assurance of hot tea and buttered scones. Heads turned, hands tidied napkins. Mrs. Renton, already half smiling as a hostess ought, glanced toward the terrace where Rose usually appeared with the first tray. Miss Marple's head, which had been slightly inclined to hear the vicar pronounce upon the success of his new roof repairs, lifted by the fraction of an inch that marks true attention. She had heard the bell, but she had also heard the way it had been rung, not the warm, decisive ring of a hand that knows it is allowed to call for people, but a single, abolished note, rather like a cough. "Ah," said Mr. Ardingly, with that affable, consultative air that meant he could be agreeable to anything provided he had arranged it himself. "I'll fetch the first tray. Let me be. Useful." Mrs. Renton. When Mrs. Pottle went to investigate Rose's absence, her voice returned at that rich, appalled pitch reserved for mislaid children and overboiled milk. "Doctor. Pritchard, Leonard, quickly, do come at once. It's the girl, Rose, in the scullery, where the stone flags smelled of soap and yesterday's onions." Rose Hitchens lay in that dreadful, humble way some people lie when the end has not asked permission. There was a mark at the side of her head, not decisive, and the damp, glazed look of the eyes. On the table, a plate of scones had been carefully split and buttered before Calamity arrived. A jam spoon rested on a saucer with a small, excellent smear that had not been wiped off because there had not been time. Dr. Pritchard's examination was swift but thorough. "I'm very sorry," he said in that level voice country doctors share. "She's quite gone." Begging your pardon, sir, Ned said suddenly, his voice roughened like an old rope. But how can it be she's gone? And the bell went just now? I heard it from the yard. We all did. The question hung in the air like smoke. They had all heard the tea bell ring at 4 o'clock precisely, summoning them to refreshments. But Rose, the only person authorized to ring it, had been dead for nearly an hour by then. Miss Marple's pale eyes rested for a moment on the bell that stood on the dresser. Her mind, that domestic, tidy mind, laid down these small facts neatly. A bell rang. The hand that should have rung it was already still, she observed Mrs. Blight's mouth tighten, as if holding back a piece of truth that did not wish to be swallowed. From the hall beyond the scullery, there came a sudden, unmistakable jingle, the little bright note of silver, twice in succession, not loud but very precise. Every head turned. They looked at the dresser and at the bell upon it, which had not moved. They looked toward the open garden doors, where the other bell sat in its saucer among the sponge cake and the clean plates. The bell chimed again, very neatly and very much as if it had something to say. It rang from the empty tea table under the cedar, where no one stood at all. Who had rung the bell to announce Rose's death, and how could a dead girl's final duty continue to echo through the afternoon air, summoning help that would arrive too late? For a moment, the afternoon seemed to hold its breath. The impossible chiming had left everyone suspended between disbelief and the growing certainty that something far more sinister than a simple accident had occurred at Graythorne House. Miss Marple's pale eyes moved thoughtfully from face to face, noting how each person received this new impossibility, some with genuine bewilderment, others with the particular stillness that comes when one's worst fears begin to take shape. Colonel Denham cleared his throat with military precision. "No one is to disturb anything," he announced, taking charge as men of his generation were trained to do. "Dr. Pritchard, if you would examine the scene more thoroughly. Someone must fetch the constable from Much Harton immediately." Young Ned Coombs stepped forward, his face bearing that peculiar pallor of someone wrestling with knowledge they wished they didn't possess. "I'll go, sir," he said, but his voice caught slightly. "Only there's something I ought to say first. About Rose." "Mrs." Pottle's maternal instincts sharpened. "What is it, dear boy?" Ned's hands worked nervously at his cap. "Yesterday, when I was trimming the hedge by the kitchen window, I heard her crying. Proper sobbing. She was, and when she caught sight of me, she went white as a sheet and ran inside." He paused, swallowing hard. "She said she'd found something that weren't meant to be found, and now she didn't know what to do about it. The revelation fell among them like a stone into still water." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had somehow found their way into her hands, clicked once, a small, thoughtful sound. "How very distressing for the poor child. And this was yesterday, you say?" "Aye, miss. And there's more." Ned's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "This morning, early, I saw her talking to someone by the old oak at the lane's end, a gentleman in a good coat. But I couldn't make out his face for the shadow of his hat." Mrs. Renton's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Surely you're mistaken. Rose would never, that is. She was always so proper about her duties." Before Ned could respond, the sound of bicycle wheels on gravel announced an arrival, but instead of the constable, it was young Tommy Fisher, the greengrocer's boy, his face flushed with the importance of his message. "Begging your pardon," he panted, "but Constable Fisher, that's my uncle, he's already on his way. Had a telephone call at the station, he did, 3:30 sharp." The boy's eyes were wide with the significance of his news. A woman's voice, very quiet-like. She said, "You had better come to Graythorne House. At 4 o'clock, the bell will ring for the dead." Then the line went dead, just like that. The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple observed how this news struck each person differently. Mrs. Renton's face went ashen. Mrs. Blight's mouth tightened into a hard line, and Mr. Ardingly's usual composure slipped just enough to reveal something that might have been fear. From the garden came another soft chime, deliberate and unhurried, as if the bell itself were commenting on these revelations. This time, Miss Marple rose from her chair with the gentle determination of someone who has heard quite enough of impossibilities for one afternoon. As she moved toward the tea table, her sharp eyes caught something the others had missed, a thin strand of fishing line, nearly invisible, caught in the bark of the cedar tree and trailing down toward the bell's saucer. Miss Marple approached the fishing line with the methodical patience of someone who had spent decades untangling far more complex knots than this one. She traced its path with her pale eyes, noting how it had been threaded through the cedar's lower branches with considerable care, not the hasty work of panic, but the deliberate planning of someone who understood both the mechanics of deception and the psychology of an English village tea party. The line ran from the tree, cleverly concealed beneath scattered leaves, to where it disappeared under the edge of the white tablecloth. But Miss Marple's keen gaze followed it further still, past the tea service and toward the French doors of the morning room, where it vanished into the shadows of the house itself. "How very thoughtful of someone," she murmured, her voice carrying that tone of mild appreciation one might use when admiring a particularly well-executed piece of embroidery. "They've taken considerable trouble to ensure we would all hear the bell at precisely the right moment." Dr. Pritchard, who had been watching her investigation with growing fascination, stepped closer. "You mean this was all planned? The timing? The discovery? Everything?" Before Miss Marple could respond, the sharp clatter of bicycle wheels on gravel announced an arrival. Constable Fisher dismounted with the heavy sigh of a man whose afternoon had taken an unwelcome turn toward complexity. Behind him came Sergeant Miller, younger and more eager, his notebook already poised for action. "Constable. Thank goodness." "Mrs." Renton breathed, her composure finally beginning to crack. "It's Rose, our housemaid. She's been murdered." As the constable began his preliminary examination and the assembled guests offered their fragmented accounts, Miss Marple quietly followed the fishing line's path into the morning room. What she discovered there made her pause with genuine admiration for the murderer's ingenuity. The line terminated at a magnificent long-case clock that stood against the far wall, one of those solemn, dignified timepieces that seemed to embody the very essence of English respectability. Around the clock's minute hand, someone had fashioned a tiny loop secured with a dab of sealing wax. A small lead weight provided the necessary tension, and the entire mechanism was designed to activate at precisely 4 o'clock when the minute hand's movement would pull the line taut. "Remarkable," Colonel Denham muttered, having followed her into the room. "Crude perhaps, but effective." Mr. Ardingly appeared in the doorway, his usual composure slipping just enough to reveal something that might have been fear. "Why, that's quite ingenious," he said, his voice too carefully controlled. "Though rather theatrical, don't you think? The work of someone with a flair for the dramatic." Miss Marple's attention had shifted to the writing desk beneath the window, where a faint ring on the blotter suggested a glass had been set down recently by an unsteady hand. Within easy reach, a detail that would prove more significant than anyone yet realized. It was then that Constable Fisher made his own disturbing discovery. After conferring quietly with young Tommy Fisher, he cleared his throat with the gravity of a man about to deliver unwelcome news. "I've had word from the telephone exchange," he announced. "Miss Puckett keeps careful records of all calls. That anonymous tip about coming to Graythorne House at 4 o'clock, it originated from this very house at 3:30. The revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. "Mrs." Renton sank into the nearest chair as if her legs had suddenly forgotten their purpose. "Mrs." Blight's face went rigid with the particular expression of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed. "But that's impossible." "Mrs." Pottle whispered. "Who among us would have known would have been so certain?" "Someone who had already committed murder," Dr. Pritchard said grimly, "and wanted to ensure the body would be discovered at precisely the right moment." Miss Marple observed how this news affected each person differently. Mrs. Renton's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt. Mr. Ardingly's eyes darted nervously between the clock and the telephone. Colonel Denham's military bearing stiffened with outrage at such calculated deception. But it was Mrs. Blight who provided the next piece of the puzzle. The cook had been unusually quiet since the discovery of Rose's body, her face bearing that particular rigidity of someone wrestling with knowledge they wished they didn't possess. "There's something I must tell you," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. About Rose. These past weeks, she'd been different, secretive-like. She'd taken to locking her room at night, which she'd never done before. Mrs. Blight's eyes darted nervously toward Mrs. Renton, and yesterday morning I caught her going through Mrs. Renton's writing desk, this very desk. Mrs. Renton's face went ashen. My desk? But why would she? What could she possibly want with my private papers? That's just it, ma'am. When I questioned her, she went red as a beetroot and claimed she was only dusting. But there wasn't a cloth in sight, and I could tell by the way the dust lay that no cleaning had been done. Young Ned Coombs, who had been listening with growing agitation, stepped forward. Rose wasn't a thief, he said fiercely. She was as honest as the day is long. If she was searching through papers, she had good reason. She told me she'd found something that frightened her. Miss Marple's pale eyes moved thoughtfully from face to face, noting the subtle interplay of glances between Mrs. Renton and Mr. Ardingly. The way Colonel Denham's jaw tightened whenever the clock merchant spoke, the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from Ned despite his protestations of Rose's innocence. From her handbag, she withdrew a small magnifying glass, the sort of practical tool that elderly ladies often carry for reading fine print, and examined the telephone more closely. What she saw there made her eyebrows rise by the merest fraction of an inch. Constable, she said mildly, you might find it interesting to dust this telephone for fingerprints. I believe you'll discover that it was used quite recently by someone whose hands were not entirely steady. As Sergeant Miller began to prepare his dusting powder, Mrs. Blight suddenly gasped and pointed toward the floor beside the desk. There, partially hidden beneath the Persian rug, lay a small brass key attached to a ribbon of pale blue silk, a ribbon that was darkened at one end with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. That's the key to the blue bedroom, Mrs. Blight whispered, her voice filled with dread. The room Mrs. Renton lets to special guests. But how did it come to be here? And why is there blood on the ribbon? The discovery of the bloodied key sent a chill through the assembled company that seemed to settle into the very walls of Graythorne House. Constable Fisher lifted it carefully with his handkerchief, examining the darkened silk ribbon with the practiced eye of a man who had seen too much violence in his years of service. This blood is recent, Dr. Pritchard observed, leaning closer. No more than a few hours old, I'd say. And that's definitely the blue bedroom key I recognize, Mrs. Renton's aunt's distinctive ribbon work. Mrs. Renton's composure finally cracked entirely. But that's impossible. The room has been empty since Mr. Redder, note of Redder, Thornfield departed so suddenly last month. I've kept it locked ever since. Miss Marple's pale eyes moved thoughtfully from the key to Mrs. Renton's trembling hands. How unfortunate that his departure was sudden. One does hope there was no unpleasantness involved. Colonel Denham's military bearing stiffened with recognition. Thornfield, you say? Tall fellow. Claimed to be in antiquities? I warned. You about that man? Isabel. His credentials were questionable at best. We'll need to examine that room immediately, Constable Fisher declared, already moving toward the stairs. Mrs. Renton, I'll require a full account of this Mr. Thornfield's activities while he was your guest. As they ascended to the first floor, Miss Marple noted how Mr. 44, Ardingly's usual urbane composure, had developed several small cracks. His eyes darted nervously between the key and the staircase, and when he thought no one was watching, his tongue darted across suddenly dry lips. The blue bedroom door stood slightly ajar despite Mrs. Renton's certainty that she had locked it. Inside, the scene that greeted them made even Constable Fisher draw a sharp breath. The room had been thoroughly searched by someone in considerable haste, drawers hung open, their contents scattered, and the mattress pulled askew. But it was the leather portfolio on the writing desk that commanded attention, expensive and well-made. It bore the initials R.T. in gold leaf. Inside, scattered papers revealed certificates of authentication for various antiquities, all bearing signatures that appeared suspiciously similar to the untrained eye. Forgeries, Colonel Denham pronounced grimly. I knew that fellow was trouble. Mrs. Blight, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. That explains the extra washing. Sheets came down from this room long after Mr. Thornfield had supposedly left. Rose said she was being thorough, but I found it odd. Young Ned stepped forward reluctantly. Rose was coming out of this room late one night last week. Near midnight it was. She looked proper frightened and made me promise not to tell anyone. Miss Marple's attention had fixed on something else entirely, a letter written in Rose's careful hand, lying among the scattered documents. The salutation was clearly visible. Dear Mr. Ardingly. The silence that followed was profound. Every eye turned to the clock. Merchant, whose face had taken on the peculiar grayish pallor of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. I can explain, he began, but his voice cracked like a schoolboy's. Constable Fisher's hand moved instinctively toward his handcuffs. I think you'd better do just that, sir. But before Mr. Ardingly could speak, the sound of running footsteps echoed from the garden below, followed by a woman's scream that cut through the afternoon air like a blade. Someone had made another terrible discovery, and the mystery was about to deepen considerably. The scream had come from Mrs. Pottle, who stood frozen beside the garden shed, with one hand pressed to her throat, and the other pointing at something that glinted among the disturbed earth near the rose bushes. As the group rushed down from the blue bedroom, Miss Marple noted how Mr. Ardingly hung back, his usual composure replaced by the particular pallor of someone who already suspected what they would find. What greeted them was both more and less than another body, a leather traveling case. Expensive and well made, half buried beneath a hasty covering of leaves and soil. The brass corners were tarnished with damp, and the initials R.T. gleamed dully in the afternoon light. That's Thornfield's case, Colonel Denham said grimly. But I thought you said he'd taken all his belongings when he left, Mrs. Renton. Mrs. Renton swayed dangerously, her face drained of all color. He did. I saw him carry everything to the cab myself. This makes no sense at all. Constable Fisher lifted the case carefully, noting its considerable weight. Inside, wrapped hastily in newspaper, were several valuable items, a medieval manuscript, what appeared to be a silver chalice, and a collection of small antiquities that seemed oddly familiar to those who had visited the local museum. Doctor, Pritchard examined the case more closely. This has been buried for some time, several weeks, I'd estimate. Long enough for the leather to take on this particular discoloration. Miss Marple's attention had fixed on something else entirely, a small piece of fishing line caught in the case's brass corner, identical to the line they had discovered leading to the bell mechanism. How curious that the same materials should appear in such different contexts, she murmured, her pale eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face. Young Ned stepped forward reluctantly. Rose knew about this case. She told me she'd seen someone burying something by the roses late one night. Said she was too frightened to investigate properly, but she'd marked the spot. Mrs. Blight nodded grimly. That explains why she'd taken to walking in the garden after dark these past weeks. I thought it was just nerves, but she was keeping watch. Mr. Ardingly, who had remained conspicuously silent, finally spoke with forced lightness. Perhaps Thornfield forgot something and returned for it. These antiquities dealers can be quite absent-minded about their collections. Absent-minded enough to bury valuable items in a garden? Colonel Denham's voice carried the cold authority of a man accustomed to detecting deception. I think not, sir. Constable Fisher was examining the newspaper wrapping when he made another disturbing discovery. This is last month's paper, the same week Thornfield supposedly departed. But look at this. He held up a fragment that bore a partial address in Rose's careful handwriting. The assembled company digested this information with varying degrees of shock and calculation. Miss Marple observed how each person received the news, Mrs. Renton's genuine bewilderment, Mrs. Blight's grim satisfaction at having her suspicions confirmed, and Mr. Ardingly's increasing agitation. But it was the discovery of a small brass key hidden beneath the manuscript that provided the next crucial piece of the puzzle. Unlike the blue bedroom key they had found earlier, this one was smaller, more delicate, and bore the distinctive patina of frequent handling. That's the key to Mrs. Renton's writing desk. Mrs. Blight announced with certainty. I've seen Rose polishing it often enough. The implications were staggering. Rose had not only discovered Thornfield's buried possessions, but had somehow acquired the key to investigate further. Her systematic approach to uncovering the truth had ultimately led to her death. They returned to the morning room with the gravity of people who had glimpsed the true scope of the deception at Graythorne House. The small brass key seemed to pulse with significance in Constable Fisher's handkerchief, while Mr. Ardingly maintained his position at the edge of the group, with the careful distance of someone who feared being drawn into the center of suspicion. Miss Marple settled herself near the writing desk with the quiet authority of someone who understood that the most important truths often resided in the most mundane places. "Mrs. Renton," she said in her gentle way, "these old desks often came with duplicate keys. Your aunt was quite practical about such matters, I imagine." Mrs. Renton pressed her fingers to her temples. "There were 2 keys, yes. Aunt Constance kept one on her watch chain, and the spare lived in the little china swan on the mantelpiece. But I haven't seen the second since early spring." The constable tried the recovered key in the desk's central drawer, where it turned with the smooth precision of frequent use. Inside lay the ordered chaos of domestic life, household accounts, correspondence, and beneath them, a second ledger bound in green leather that seemed to whisper of secrets. Mrs. Blight leaned forward with the sharp attention of someone whose suspicions were finally being vindicated. "That's not Mrs. Renton's writing," she observed, pointing to entries in a masculine hand. "Those figures, they're in pounds, not shillings and pence." The ledger revealed a troubling pattern. Regular, payments marked, from F.A., balanced against mysterious expenditures labeled Blue Room expenses and RT requirements. Most disturbing of all were the recent entries, growing increasingly desperate in tone, culminating in a final notation: "Must recover items immediately." Associates growing impatient. Colonel Denham's military bearing stiffened as he examined the handwriting. "That's Thornfield's script, without question. But these associates he mentions, who were they? And what did they want recovered?" Mr. Ardingly's composure had developed several alarming cracks. When Dr. Fizzidence certain, Pritchard observed that the ink was fresh, no more than a few days old. The clock merchant's hands began to tremble visibly. "The stolen museum pieces," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her pale eyes moving from the ledger to Mr. Ardingly's increasingly agitated state. "Someone needed them back urgently enough to commit murder for them." Young Ned stepped forward reluctantly. "Rose showed me a letter, last week. It was signed with just the initial F shund, and warned her to keep quiet about what she'd discovered. Said she'd be kept safe if she cooperated." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Rose had been blackmailed into silence, but her conscience had ultimately proven stronger than her fear. Constable Fisher was examining the desk more closely when he made another crucial discovery. Tucked beneath the blotter was a small piece of sealing wax. Still bearing the clear impression of a signet ring, a heraldic griffin pressed into the red surface with the precision of long habit. Miss Marple's attention fixed on Colonel Denham's right hand, where an identical griffin gleamed on his regimental ring. The military man noticed her gaze and stiffened with offended dignity. "These rings are common enough among the regiment," he said coldly. "Half the officers carry them." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, though one wonders how many of those officers had occasion to seal documents in Mrs. Renton's morning room. Before anyone could respond, the telephone rang with shrill insistence, its sound cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. Mrs. Renton reached for it with trembling fingers, but Miss Marple's gentle hand stayed her movement. "I think," the elderly detective said with quiet authority, "we should let it ring. Someone is expecting news of our investigation, and their patience, or lack thereof, may prove quite illuminating." The telephone continued its shrill insistence, each ring seeming to stretch the nerves in the morning room to their breaking point. Miss Marple counted silently 8 rings, 9, 10, observing how each person responded to the sound. Mrs. Renton's hands twisted her handkerchief into desperate knots, while Mr. Ardingly's eyes darted repeatedly toward the French doors with the particular calculation of someone measuring distances. On the 12th ring, the sound ceased abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt more ominous than the clamor itself. Constable Fisher moved to the telephone with professional caution, lifting the receiver to his ear. What he heard made his weathered face go grim. "Lines still connected," he reported quietly. "Someone's listening on the other end." Miss Marple's pale eyes sparkled with the particular satisfaction of someone whose theory was being proven correct. "How very interesting." They're waiting to hear if their call was answered. One might say they're monitoring our investigation quite closely. The silence stretched taut until finally, the distinct click of a receiver being replaced echoed through the line. Fisher immediately rang the exchange, and Miss Puckett's crisp voice responded with the efficiency of someone who missed very little. "That call originated from the kiosk by the 7 Kestrels," she reported. "Same caller as before, very light touch on the dial, Constable. Educated hands, I'd say. Not a laborer or farmer. And there's something else." The caller waited exactly 30 seconds between attempts. As if timing something quite precisely, Dr. Pritchard had been examining the signet ring impression in the sealing wax with his magnifying glass. "Colonel Denham, if you would permit me to compare your ring more closely to this impression." The colonel extended his hand with military stiffness, his jaw set in rigid lines. The comparison was unmistakable. Every detail of the griffin matched perfectly, down to a tiny chip in the lower claw that spoke of years of wear. The pressure required to make such a clear impression, Dr. Pritchard observed carefully, suggests considerable force was applied. Far more than would be needed for sealing an ordinary letter. Colonel Denham's face darkened with indignation. "If you're suggesting I used excessive force on some innocent correspondence, Doctor, you're quite mistaken. The wax was particularly hard yesterday evening, required a firm hand to make any impression at all." Mrs. Blight stepped forward with the grim satisfaction of someone whose suspicions were finally being vindicated. "That may be, Colonel, but it doesn't explain why your signet was being used in this house after hours." "Mrs. Renton retires early, and the household is locked by 9 o'clock sharp." Young Ned, who had been listening with growing understanding, suddenly spoke up. "Rose mentioned seeing a light in the morning room late Sunday night. Said she thought it was burglars. But when she crept down to look, she heard voices, familiar voices, she said, but couldn't make out the words." Mr. Ardingly's composure had developed several alarming cracks during this exchange. When Mrs. Renton observed that he seemed quite pale, he attempted a laugh that emerged more like a cough. The strain of the afternoon, naturally. Such terrible events are shocking to civilized sensibilities. Miss Marple had been examining something else entirely, a small smear on the telephone's brass handle that caught the light at a particular angle. "How curious," she murmured, dabbing it gently with her handkerchief. The fabric came away with a faint reddish stain. "This appears to be sealing wax, still slightly soft. Someone handled this telephone very recently with wax on their fingers. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Someone in this very room had been using sealing wax within the past few hours, the same red wax that bore Colonel Denham's signet impression." From the garden came the sound of rapid footsteps on gravel, and Sergeant Miller burst through the French doors, his face flushed with excitement and his notebook clutched in his hand. "Constable," he called breathlessly, "I've found something in the potting shed, something that changes everything we thought we knew about this case." Sergeant Miller's breathless excitement proved entirely justified as he led them across the garden, toward the weathered potting shed that stood half hidden behind a tangle of overgrown jasmine. Miss Marple noted how Mr. Ardingly hung back, his usual urbane composure replaced by the particular pallor of someone who already suspected what they would find. The shed's interior smelled of damp earth and old timber. But beneath those familiar scents lay something else, something sweet and wrong, that made Mrs. Pottle press her handkerchief to her nose. Sergeant Miller had disturbed the neat arrangement of peat sacks, revealing freshly turned soil beneath that bore the unmistakable signs of recent excavation. Dr. Pritchard knelt beside the disturbed earth with weary professionalism, his hands working with the delicacy one brings to fragile china. What emerged from the shallow grave made even Constable Fisher draw a sharp breath. The pale, ruined face of a man in his 40s, his features still recognizable despite weeks in the ground. "Roland Thornfield," Mrs. Renton whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how can this be? I saw him leave with his own eyes." Miss Marple's attention had fixed on something else entirely, a length of thin cord coiled on the potting bench, its surface stained with the same red sealing wax they had discovered throughout their investigation. Above it, a small brass pulley bore the telltale grooves of recent use, while the shed's door jamb showed clear evidence of a line having been drawn through it under considerable tension. "The bell mechanism was tested here," she observed mildly. "Someone took considerable care to ensure their theatrical performance would succeed." Doctor. Pritchard's examination revealed the cause of death: a ligature around the throat, applied with deadly efficiency. In the dead man's breast pocket, Sergeant Miller discovered a flat silver case containing visiting cards and a torn fragment of paper bearing the salutation, "Dear Mr. Ardingly," in Rose's careful handwriting. The implications struck the assembled company with the force of revelation. Rose had not only discovered Thornfield's murder, but had attempted to confront his killer directly, a confrontation that had ultimately cost her own life. Colonel Denham examined the scene with military precision. The body was buried with considerably more care than the antiquities. Different temperaments at work, or perhaps different levels of panic. Mr. Ardingly's hands trembled as he reached for his pocket watch, his voice cracking with desperate indignation. This proves nothing conclusive. Correspondence between business associates is hardly evidence of murder. But Miss Marple had been studying the clay-stained soles of his city-made shoes, the same pale clay that marked the rose bed where Mrs. Pottle had made her earlier discovery. The web of evidence was drawing tighter with each revelation, and the clock merchant's carefully constructed facade was crumbling like ancient mortar. From the direction of the house, the telephone began to ring again, slow, deliberate, counting out its summons with almost human patience. This time, the sound seemed to weave itself through the smell of soil and secrets like a question that refused to be silenced. Mrs. Blight stepped forward with grim satisfaction. Rose knew the truth, didn't she? That's why she had to die. She discovered not just the theft, but the murder that covered it up. The persistent ringing drew them back across the garden with urgent purpose, the telephone's summons cutting through the late afternoon air like a blade. In the morning room, Constable Fisher lifted the receiver with professional caution, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Felix, thank God," the cultured voice carried clearly enough for all to hear. "The arrangement we discussed there have been complications. The items must be moved tonight, not tomorrow. My associates are growing impatient." Fisher's eyes met Miss Marple's across the room as he replied with deliberate calm. "Mr. Ardingly is currently assisting with our inquiries. Perhaps you could identify yourself." The line went dead with a sharp click, leaving behind a silence that seemed to pulse with revelation. Mr. Ardingly's face had gone the color of old parchment, and his hands trembled with barely controlled panic. "I can explain everything," he began, his voice cracking like thin ice. "Thornfield was blackmailing me, threatening to expose certain irregularities in my business dealings unless I helped him dispose of the stolen antiquities. When Rose discovered his body in the blue bedroom, she came to me for help. I thought I could protect her by keeping her quiet." Colonel Denham's military bearing stiffened with outrage. "By murdering her, you mean?" "No." Ardingly's protest carried the desperate ring of partial truth. "She was alive when I left her yesterday evening. Someone who knew about our arrangement must have silenced her permanently." Miss Marple's attention had fixed on something else entirely, a small smear of red sealing wax on Mrs. Renton's cuff, barely visible against the dark fabric, but unmistakably fresh. The landlady had been unusually quiet throughout the investigation, her distress apparently genuine, but the evidence suggested a more complex involvement than mere shocked innocence. "Mrs. Renton," Miss Marple said gently, "perhaps you could explain how sealing wax came to stain your sleeve. It appears to be quite recent." Mrs. Renton's composure finally shattered completely. "I never meant for anyone to die," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "When I discovered what Thornfield was really doing in the blue bedroom, using my house as a storage depot for stolen goods, I confronted him. We struggled, and he fell, striking his head on the fireplace fender. Doctor." Pritchard leaned forward with professional interest. "That would explain the head wound we observed. But what about Rose?" Before Mrs. Renton could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps on gravel announced another arrival. Through the French doors burst a figure that made everyone freeze. A tall, distinguished man in a traveling coat, his face bearing the particular desperation of someone whose carefully laid plans had gone catastrophically wrong. "Isobel," he called breathlessly. "We must leave immediately. The police." He stopped abruptly, taking in the assembled company with growing horror. Miss Marple's pale eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of someone whose theory was finally being proven correct. Mr. Thornfield, I presume? How very interesting that reports of your death appear to have been greatly exaggerated. The man who stood framed in the French doors, alive and undeniably solid, sent a shock through the morning room that seemed to stop time itself. Roland Thornfield, for it was unmistakably he stood there with the particular pallor of someone whose carefully laid plans had collapsed entirely. His traveling coat was mud-stained, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and his eyes held the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. Constable Fisher moved with professional swiftness, positioning himself between Thornfield and any possible escape route. "I think you'd better explain yourself, sir," he said with quiet authority, starting with how a dead man comes to be standing in Mrs. Renton's garden. Thornfield's shoulders sagged with the weight of inevitable defeat. "I received word that my arrangements had attracted unwelcome attention. I came to remove any further inconvenience to the household." His eyes found Mrs. Renton's face, and something like genuine regret flickered there. "Though I see I'm rather too late for that." Miss Marple's pale eyes moved thoughtfully from the living Thornfield to Mrs. Renton's stricken face. "How very interesting," she murmured. "If Mr. Thornfield is indeed alive and well, then who is the unfortunate gentleman we discovered in the potting shed?" Dr. Pritchard stepped closer to examine Thornfield, with professional thoroughness, checking his pulse, peering into his eyes, confirming what they could all see. "He's certainly alive, Miss Marple. Which means our identification of the victim was based on circumstantial evidence rather than fact." "A very reasonable assumption," Miss Marple agreed, her voice carrying that gentle tone that somehow made the most damning observations sound like casual conversation, one that was, I suspect, carefully encouraged. Her attention fixed on Mrs. Renton, whose composure had finally begun to crack entirely. "You said you struggled with Mr. Thornfield and he fell, striking his head. But it wasn't Mr. Thornfield at all, was it, Mrs. Renton?" The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Renton's hands trembled as she pressed them to her face, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It was Leonard, my husband. He was supposed to be dead, drowned at sea 3 years ago. But he came back." The revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Colonel Denham's military bearings stiffened with shock, while Mr. Ardingly made a small, strangled sound of understanding. "Leonard had always been involved in questionable dealings," Mrs. Renton continued, her voice gaining a desperate clarity. "Those antiquities, the ones everyone assumed Mr. Thornfield had stolen, they were Leonard's. He'd hidden them in the blue bedroom years ago, before he disappeared. When I thought he was dead, I began letting the room to guests for income." Thornfield stepped forward, his usual composure replaced by something approaching genuine remorse. "I discovered the items quite by accident when the floorboard came loose. Mrs. Renton was desperate for money, and I offered to help her sell them discreetly. It seemed a harmless arrangement. Until Leonard returned," Mrs. Renton whispered. "He appeared Sunday night, demanding his property back. He found us in the blue bedroom, arguing over how to handle the situation. He flew into a rage, accused me of betraying him, of stealing what was rightfully his. When he attacked Mr. Thornfield, I tried to intervene. In the struggle, Leonard fell backward, striking his head on the fireplace fender. The sound," she shuddered. "I'll never forget that sound." Young Ned stepped forward, his face bearing the particular anguish of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. "That's when Rose saw the light in the morning room. She heard voices, familiar voices," she said. "She must have witnessed something. She discovered the body the next morning when she was cleaning." Mrs. Renton confirmed. "I convinced her to help me move Leonard to the potting shed. Told her it was an accident and that we needed time to think about how to handle the situation properly. But Rose had such a strong conscience." Mrs. Blight nodded grimly. "She was never the same after that night. Jumpy as a cat, she was, and asking strange questions about the blue bedroom guest." Miss Marple's attention had fixed on something else entirely, the way several people in the room had reacted to Mrs. Renton's confession. Mr. Ardingly's relief was palpable, but Colonel Denham's face had taken on a peculiar rigidity. and his hands had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly. Rose threatened to go to the police. Mrs. Renton continued. Yesterday afternoon, she said she couldn't keep silent any longer. Her conscience wouldn't allow it. She said she'd written letters to Mr. Ardingly. To me, explaining everything she knew. But someone silenced her before she could send them, Dr. Pritchard observed grimly. Someone who knew about her discovery and couldn't afford to let her speak. The telephone rang suddenly, its shrill sound cutting through the tension like a knife. This time, Constable Fisher answered immediately, his face growing increasingly grim as he listened to the voice on the other end. That was the station, he announced after replacing the receiver. They've traced the earlier calls to a telephone box near the Seven Kestrels. The caller has been monitoring our investigation quite closely, it seems. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the gentle determination of someone who had heard quite enough of half-truths and careful omissions. I think, she said mildly, it's time we addressed the question of who actually killed poor Rose, because while Mrs. Renton may have been responsible for her husband's death, someone else entirely orchestrated that elaborate bell-ringing deception. Her pale eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in each face with the careful attention of someone who understood that the most important truths were often written in the smallest gestures. Someone who knew the household routines intimately, who had access to the necessary materials, and who possessed both the mechanical knowledge to construct such a device and the cold calculation to use a dead girl's final duty as the means of discovery. From the garden came another soft chime of the silver bell, stirred perhaps by the evening breeze, but the sound seemed to carry an accusation that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. The revelation of Thornfield's living presence sent ripples of confusion through the assembled company, but Miss Marple's pale eyes held the serene confidence of someone whose theory was finally crystallizing into certainty. She observed how each person absorbed this new information, Mrs. Renton's genuine bewilderment, Mr. Ardingly's visible relief, and most tellingly, Colonel Denham's rigid composure that suggested not surprise but careful calculation. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. If Mr. Thornfield is indeed alive, then our entire understanding of recent events requires considerable revision. Her gaze moved thoughtfully around the room. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to orchestrate not just a murder, but its discovery in the most theatrical manner possible. She rose from her chair with deliberate grace, moving toward the long case clock where the ingenious timing mechanism had been constructed. The person who created this device possessed very specific knowledge, military precision in timing, mechanical aptitude, and most importantly, intimate familiarity with Graythorne House's daily routines. Colonel Denham's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Many of us have mechanical knowledge, Miss Marple. It's hardly conclusive evidence. Indeed, Colonel, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, examining the fishing line still caught in the clock's mechanism. Though I find it curious that this particular knot, she indicated where the line had been secured, is what the scouts call a constrictor knot. Rather specialized knowledge, wouldn't you say? Inexorability. Young Ned mentioned that Rose had asked about fishing tackle recently. She'd noticed someone working in the garden after dark, measuring distances near the cedar tree, someone who understood both rigging and timing with military precision. Dr. Pritchard leaned forward with professional interest. The telephone call to the station was made at precisely 3:30. Miss Puckett noted the caller's methodical approach, 30-second intervals between dial attempts, as if counting time by instinct rather than by watching a clock. Miss Marple's attention fixed on Colonel Denham's breast pocket, where the outline of a pocket chronometer was clearly visible. You carry a stopwatch, don't you, Colonel? I've observed you timing events at village fetes with remarkable precision. 30 seconds would be second nature to someone with your training. The Colonel's composure developed several small cracks. This is entirely circumstantial, Miss Marple. Perhaps, she conceded mildly, moving to examine the telephone. Though there's also the matter of the sealing wax. Dr. Pritchard noted it was still soft when we discovered the signet impression, your signet, Colonel, complete with that distinctive chip in the griffin's lower claw. She dabbed the telephone receiver with her handkerchief, revealing a faint reddish residue. Someone handled this telephone with wax on their fingers very recently. Mrs. Renton looked up with dawning horror. Rose came to see you yesterday afternoon, didn't she, Colonel? She said she needed advice from someone she trusted. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Colonel Denham's military bearing began to waver, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of evidence mounted against him. She was going to destroy everything, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Not just expose Leonard's death, but reveal the entire Antiquities operation. My reputation, Mrs. Renton's future, all of it would have been ruined by a housemaid's misguided conscience. Young Ned stepped forward, his face pale with understanding. What did you do to her? Colonel Denham's confession emerged with the mechanical precision of a military report. I invited her to discuss the situation privately. I thought I could reason with her, perhaps arrange some compensation for her discretion, but she was utterly determined to do the right thing, as she put it. When she tried to leave, I attempted to restrain her. She pulled away and struck her head on my mantelpiece. The head wound, Dr. Pritchard murmured grimly, but that wasn't fatal. No, the colonel whispered. She remained conscious, still insisting she would go to the police. I couldn't allow that. So, His voice broke entirely. Miss Marple's pale eyes held no judgment, only the weary understanding of someone who had witnessed too much of human nature's capacity for self-justification. You strangled her with the cord from your dressing gown. Quick, efficient, the work of someone with military training. The silence that followed was profound. Even the afternoon birds seemed to have fallen quiet. Then, Miss Marple continued gently, you transported her body to the scullery and began your elaborate deception. You constructed the bell mechanism, tested it in the potting shed, and timed everything precisely. The telephone call at 3:30, the bell at 4 o'clock, all designed to ensure official discovery under controlled circumstances. Constable Fisher moved forward with professional determination. Colonel Denham, I'm arresting you for the murder of Rose Hitchens. The old soldier's shoulders sagged with the weight of inevitable defeat. I served my country for 40 years, he said quietly. I thought I was serving it still, protecting respectability, maintaining order, but I see now that I was only protecting my own vision of how things should be. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Mrs. Renton turned away, unable to witness the fall of someone she had trusted. Mrs. Blight moved to comfort her with surprising gentleness, while young Ned stood frozen in grief for Rose's lost innocence. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with quiet satisfaction. The mystery was solved. Justice would be served, but the human cost would linger long after the headlines faded. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who believed themselves to be maintaining order while destroying the very thing they claimed to protect. The click of handcuffs on Colonel Denham's wrists seemed to echo through Graythorne House with finality, marking the end of an elaborate deception that had cost 2 lives. As Constable Fisher led the broken man away, his military bearing finally collapsed under the weight of his confession. The assembled company struggled to comprehend how thoroughly their quiet village world had been shattered. Mrs. Renton collapsed into the nearest chair, her composure finally cracking entirely as the full implications settled upon her. The woman who had begun the day hosting a respectable garden party now faced scandal, financial ruin, and the knowledge that her trust in a respected neighbor had cost an innocent girl her life. Mrs. Blight moved to her side with surprising gentleness, her usual sharp tongue replaced by maternal comfort. I don't understand how I could have been so blind, Mrs. Renton whispered. When Rose came to me with her concerns, I suggested she speak with the colonel, because I thought he would know how to handle things properly. Young Ned stood frozen by the French doors, his grief for Rose mingling with rage at the injustice of her death. She only wanted to do what was right, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ardingly, his relief at escaping murder charges palpable, began distancing himself from the day's events, with renewed confidence. However, Constable Fisher had made it clear that his involvement in receiving stolen goods and attempting to silence Rose would face thorough investigation. The clock merchant's future remained precarious despite his survival. Roland Thornfield, the man supposed to be dead, maintained his position by the garden doors with guarded resignation. His involvement in the antiquities trade was undeniable, but at least he lived a fact that seemed to bring him strange comfort amidst the chaos. Miss Marple had been examining something on the writing desk, a sealed envelope in Rose's careful handwriting, addressed to Mrs. Renton. The letter, when opened, revealed the housemaid's final communication, both apology and explanation written with the precision of someone who understood she might not have another opportunity. "Dear Mrs. Renton," it began, "I hope you will forgive me for the trouble I am about to bring upon your house. I cannot keep silent about what I have discovered, for silence makes me as guilty as those who committed these terrible acts." The letter detailed Rose's growing fear of Colonel Denham, whose questions about her knowledge had become increasingly pressing. "He keeps asking what I saw and what I remember," she had written. "His manner is very kind, but there is something in his eyes that frightens me." Dr. Pritchard read over Mrs. Renton's shoulder, his professional composure giving way to genuine emotion. She knew she was in danger but felt she had no choice. "That takes extraordinary courage." Constable Fisher returned with additional revelations from his investigation. The recovered antiquities had been identified as items stolen from the British Museum 18 months prior. Leonard Renton, it emerged, had worked as a night watchman there before faking his death to avoid prosecution when the theft was discovered. Colonel Denham's military connections provided contacts in the international market. Fisher explained he'd been facilitating sales while taking substantial commissions. When Rose threatened to expose everything, he chose murder over disgrace. As the afternoon light faded, the various participants began departing with the peculiar heaviness that follows terrible revelations. Thornfield and Ardingly were escorted away for further questioning, while the household staff began the grim process of adjusting to their new reality. Miss Marple took one final look at the cedar tree where the ingenious bell mechanism had been constructed. The fishing line had been removed, evidence collected, but the memory of that impossible chime would linger in everyone's minds. "Poor Rose," she murmured. She rang that bell faithfully every day, calling others to comfort and refreshment. In the end, her final service was to call for justice, even from beyond death. The irony was both terrible and fitting. A housemaid whose greatest pride had been her reliability had found a way to remain reliable even in death, ensuring her killer's elaborate deception would ultimately lead to his downfall. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she reflected on the afternoon's revelations with the weary wisdom of someone who had witnessed too much of human nature's capacity for both evil and redemption. "What I find most disturbing," she observed to Dr. Pritchard, "is how Colonel Denham convinced himself he was serving a greater good. In his mind, preserving social order justified any means, including taking an innocent life." The village would soon buzz with news spreading from Tommy Fisher to Miss Puckett at the telephone exchange, then through every tea shop and garden gate. There would be those claiming they always knew something was wrong with the colonel, and others lamenting Rose, the poor, sweet girl. The scandal would be dissected and embellished over countless cups of tea, becoming a cautionary tale whispered for years to come. Greythorn House, once a symbol of Mrs. Renton's aspirations, would forever bear the stain of its dark secrets. The silver tea bell would likely never ring again there, its bright, innocent chime forever tainted by the memory of a dead girl's final, impossible summons. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the curious paradox of village life. Beneath the placid surface of manicured gardens and polite tea parties, the same passions, greed, and desperation simmered as fiercely as in any bustling city. Human nature remained constant, its complexities endlessly fascinating and often, tragically, deadly. Tomorrow, the village would begin its slow process of healing. The legal machinery would grind forward, statements would be taken, and justice would follow its measured course. But tonight, as Miss Marple reached the familiar turn in the lane, the scent of evening primroses heavy in the air, she carried with her the lessons of Greythorn House that truth, however painful, must eventually ring out, and that even the smallest acts of conscience can echo far beyond their intended reach. The bell had been silenced, but its message would endure.